Hello everyone, we are going to go over today some ways that you can get blur for generally cheap or cheaper than say a whole post-processing effects or the blur widget in Slate in UMG. So in Unreal, and then this also could be applied in other game engines as well, it's generally the same concept. We're going to try to use texture mipmaps to create a blur. And here's some of the effects that it's doing. So I have this little blur that's in the bottom corner of our actual texture, and you can see it's a rounded corner, so I can actually mask the blur to be a very unique shape. And then I animate that blur coming on when you hover over it. I tint it so it's darker, and then you can animate that blur off as well. So lots of possibilities. You could have all these endless combinations of using blur, your mouse, controller, fun things to do with it. I just wanted to showcase a particular example that I had in mind. So let's break it down. In this video, we're going to go over how to make this and kind of go over some of the initial concepts of mipmaps and how they're useful. So let's turn the video on and let's break it on down. First thing I'm going to do is briefly go over mipmaps. Now there's tons of topics on mipmaps, how to use mipmaps. A lot of content is out there. I would highly recommend looking it up. But in general, this is going to be a brief overview and maybe an explanation why mipmaps aren't often used in UI. So anyway, if we set these all back to default, this is what, if you regularly imported the texture in the Unreal, this is what they would be set to. And most of the time, artists go and set the texture group to UI. And that is going to set no MIPS, and the resource size is going to be a little bit smaller. Now, this is likely the case, as most things with UMG and UI. You don't get the same settings that you do for the other parts of the engine. So no MIPS for the UI texture group. Now, there's plenty of reasons that this could be the case, because you don't want to scale your icons down, you don't want them to end up blurry on lower resolutions, maybe they end up too blurry at higher resolutions. There's so many reasons that MIPS in UI don't always make sense, but in some instances they do. And in this particular case, I think utilizing what the engine's good at and what graphics cards are great at is MIP generation and reading the proper MIP. We can actually use that to our advantage to create a fun blur setting here. So while most of the time UI has no MIPS, I would like to challenge that norm and say maybe we should start investigating using MIPS more in UI and for clever purposes. But what are MIPS? MIPS stand for this Latin phrase, and I'm not going to say it because I don't know how to pronounce Latin, as most folks probably don't. But this generally means much in a small space. So mipmap, M-I-P here for MIP. And this Latin phrase essentially summarizes how you get a lot of value out of a MIP for a tiny amount of extra space that it takes up. And that's a fun fact that I learned looking this up. So let's open up the wiki page and kind of see what a MIP map generally looks like when it's out in full force. So this is what a MIP turns into. So you have your full size of your original texture, then you have the texture at MIP level 1, which is half of that. The second texture at MIP level 2 is half of that, and then it goes smaller and smaller each time. So basically it's a way of generating the same image, but at half the size each time. And because of that, the resource of the mipmap actually gets to be about 1/3 the original texture size. And there's a bunch of funky math there, and you draw a triangle, and for some reason it works. I don't know why it works, but we can see it in action. So I'm gonna then check this box up here. Oh, I'm in the UI texture group, so no MIPS for me, but that's fine. If I go here and I want to say simple average, this then creates the number of MIPS, right? That resource size gets larger by 1/3. And now we can check this box. And I have it at MIP level 10, but let's go to 0 is the normal size, the original imported size. We've got the 512 here. Now this is where we see this is going to be at half the size of what it originally was. We go to level 2, that's at 256. Level 3, we're at a 128. level 4, 64, and it goes all the way down to 1 by 1 pixel. And so the setting here is set to simple average. This is just simple, whatever the MIP generation settings. This happens when the cooked build, when you cook your build, it then generates all these MIPs, and this is what then ships out with the game. So MIP 6 is what I've been testing in and been enjoying a lot. So we'll zoom all the way in here and kind of see the different MIP generation settings. So simple average, this is a MIP 6. Sharpen 0. Let's go to sharpen 10. You can see very artistic how our sharpen looks like. We can go to angular. Oh, that's not going to do it. Not in UI. Unfiltered. This is what that will look like. So there's a bunch of options here. But what I found is I really liked to get a blur effect, right, is to then generate MIPs that cause a blur. So we have blur 5 to blur 1, and there's a whole bunch of in between. I found for my particular test case, I really liked blur 5. I thought it looked pretty good, and that's where I ended up going. So that was the original MIP setting of blur 5, UI, and the general MIP that I liked messing around with was 6, but you can see each one of these. So we can go back up the chain to 5, 4, you can see we're getting a little bit less blurry each time. 3, 2, and now we have to zoom back out to 100%. 1 and 0. So the original texture, and then each step that we half the texture, we're also blurring the texture going down. That's basically what this is. Now what we can do in a material is then ask for, give me a certain MIP, and then we can call on that particular MIP. So let's open up the material. Here it is. Very, very simple. Nothing too fancy here. I will say I use the UI Material Lab. That's where these functions come from to generate these rounded boxes here. If you are interested in the UI Material Lab, you can grab it. It's totally free. It was made by some other tech UI designers at Epic, Arena and Pavlo. Really love their work. It's fantastic. You should open it up and see what it does. But anyway, that's where these functions are coming from, because sometimes when I just want to make a rounded box, I don't want to do all the SDF math myself, and I can just use this. So essentially all this is doing is if I unplug it, it's making our nice little rounded outline. And if we were to just put, I guess this is also making the rounded shape at the bottom here. You don't see it so well in this particular texture, but it's rounding the corner here, which is making a unique mask shape. So anyway, this is a fun technique. I didn't know that you could lerp the MIP level in mask and only sample the texture once. Another tech UI designer, Zell, at Epic, explained that to me, and I thought that was cool. Anyway, let's go into just generally what do we do and how do we get MIPs. So let's pull up our texture sample. Let's find ourselves a texture in here. I've got ones that I've already got the MIPs. Let's go with this one because that's what we're looking at right now. And we'll plug that into the final color. And this is generally from the texture asset. So as we get smaller, you can see it's actually blurring the texture because that's the default way that Unreal is going to handle Mipmaps. The smaller the thing is, the lower the MIP level it's looking for. So the larger it is, the more detailed it's going to blur as this gets smaller. Great, but we want to control what the blur is and when. So to do that, we can go in here, into the MIP value. We can set our own MIP value. So it says absolute 0 is the full resolution. So that's what we do here, and that's what this level is right there. So now, if I plug in just a standard old parameter in here, I can say I always want it to be, no matter the size, at 100% the resolution. So now you can see it's super crisp, super sharp, no matter what. You sometimes looks great, sometimes stuff will look aliased. This is sort of why Mipmaps are an interesting concept to get into. But let's go to my favorite Mip level 6. And now we can see, hey, this is what a blurred texture would look like using Mipmaps. All the way down, all the way up, it's the same amount. We could even go 4 here. 3. So maybe 3 is what you like most of all. And then what we can do is we can apply a mask to this level using a lerp. That's what this is doing here. So if we start previewing this node, this is basically saying wherever it is white, set the value to 6. Wherever it is black, set the value to 0. That's what this lerp is doing. And we can basically copy this. We'll say black is 0, like with the value this is our lerp. This is going to blend halfway in between equally, which is going to look a little funky. But we can say, okay, mask it to the shape. And now we have only blurred at the bottom part of the shape. And at the top part, don't blur it. And it's basically just making a blur mask. Now, again, we can control how much blur. So 3, 4, 5, 6. I like 6 for some reason. It just 8. And then we can go all the way to 10, which is basically going to give us a single 1x1 pixel. And that is the average of all of the colors of the texture. This is what it kind of averages it out to, is to that single color right there. But yeah, that's basically all this is doing that. Now, how do we animate it? What do we do here? That's the other aspect. So I'm going to plug that back in. And the rest of this material, really simple. Here's the texture. This is pushing the box down to 80% lower. So if I preview this, it's pushing the box down 80% so that it's remaining at the top 20%. And the rest of this is setting the corner radius and setting the size of it so that it matches the mask box. That's all this is doing. So short and sweet, super simple, pretty cool. Awesome. Now, inside of our widget, let's take a look at what it's doing. So here is our widget. I've gone a little overboard with the animations and the widget layout, and that is mainly because I wanted this text, no matter if it was 1 line or 2 lines, would always be centered in the bottom 20% of the screen. And then when you animate it, it anchors itself to the vertical alignment at the top. This is probably overkill. And I have this description text here. It's by default set to collapsed, and it's set to inherit. So its default visibility is set to collapse, so it doesn't turn on, and it's set to clip on demand, so it's gonna not overflow. If I say inherit, you would see it. I think I have to compile first. We would see it not clip. Maybe I have clipping somewhere else. I probably have clipping somewhere else. But yeah, I clip it so that it can't be, it can't overwrite the shape. And then let's go into the animation itself. Now I'm animating a bunch of stuff here, but let's actually see what I'm animating on the material. On the material, all I'm animating is the blur and the blur mask. I'm turning these values so I'm turning the blur off. If you see here, we basically turn the blur to, it started at 0, and it's going to go all the way till, this is a bit slow, it's going to go all the way to 6. So I'm turning the mask that we initially set up at each one of these frames. We're going to turn the mask off, and then we're going to blur the entire texture to be that blur 6. So basically what I'm doing is I'm turning this from 0 to 6, basically animating that, and turning this from 6 to something around like 1, so it like slowly blurs off and then turns on to 6. That's what I'm doing. You can instead animate, maybe if I turn this into a parameter, that -8, and then it could actually translate up as it blurs. All of these are possibilities, but this is what I ended up with. At the same time, I am tinting the blur so that the actual material of this widget is getting this gray tint. If I didn't do that, it's pretty bright. If it's a white texture, it's pretty bright underneath. And the other trick here is I'm setting the vertical alignment of our little vertical box that has this and the contents inside. I'm setting it from being to center the lines so that we could have that lovely, the text is always centered no matter if it's 2 lines, to then popping it to vertical alignment, top vertical aligned, and this makes it so when I animate this up, the text is animates all the way at the top, rather than it would then animate to fill the center of the widget. These are all kind of understanding UMG layouts and how you want stuff to parents inside of the layout align where. And that is it. The graph itself, I'm using the common button base, doing some funky things like getting the size of the spacer and setting that, but not all that interesting. I'm basically playing the animation forward when we event on hovered and play the animation reverse. These are all using, again, the UI Material Lab, which then uses Common UI, and Common UI is just handy to get these events and parent your initial widget to the common button base. That's all to say. Here is the preview that you saw before. So again, we animate that bottom horizontal bar off as then we blur the entire widget. We don't have to do that, but I think it adds a really fun effect. It makes it look like, I love it on the sword graveyard piece because it almost looks like the blur is popping back in. So it pops out and it pops back in, and it also showcases that this is truly blurring the texture behind it. It is not a different widget or a different layer on top. It's just a little detail here and there that I like. And I also was listening to a lot of Madonna while making this, so we have Hung Up and Material Girl as my Madonna references. That's basically all this is. The material's quite simple. The use case is quite simple. Now, this is clever, and again, Zell, thanks for letting me know about this, is masking it out this way, because you don't have to sample. So another way that you could do this is you could have it lerp at the end of the chain. So you sample one texture at 6 level, you sample one texture at 0, and then you could lerp these together here to your mask. You can do it, RGB. But this then requires 2 texture samples in the material. Now this is handy. Say, one thing I don't like about the blur here often is that the bottom part will wrap from the top and not look so nice. So a way you could get around that is you could scale the UVs of this one. We could scale these UVs to be slightly larger than what they are. Let's say at like 0.1.1. And so it makes it slightly larger, and therefore we don't get that wrapping around the edge. Now I think this is more apparent when I swap out to this texture specifically is the one that I see this the more in. When we swap this out, I'm gonna have to pull the texture on both. so that we can see it on both. Without that 1.1, if we unplug it, we get a hint of the bottom of the stuff coming through. And I think we see this when this is a bit less. Let's go to like 3. It's actually not too bad. But let's see without. Oh yeah, so you can see a hint of the blue and a hint of that yellow from the top of the texture is blurring into the bottom of this. Now, again, to get around this, you could then scale this texture up ever so slightly. Maybe this is too much, maybe 0.5. Because we want this to generally line up right, and then we don't get that bleeding of the bottom part of it. And we can go back to 6 here. Anyway, it's a preference thing. Just something, if you did want to sample the texture twice, totally doable, but I thought this was a clever way to not need to sample the texture twice here by using the mask on the level instead. And then you don't have the sample, you don't have the texture twice in memory, that sort of thing. But yeah, really clever, interesting way to handle Mipmaps using blur. You can see it animates pretty well off and on. Just remember, set those blur settings, and it can even be in the UI texture group, but you're just overriding the default texture group settings. So hopefully this was helpful for folks, and maybe that'll be what you need. The one thing this won't do, the one caveat is, this won't blur on top of other objects, right? This is a single material that has an image material animation here. This will not blur on top of the world behind it or the UI scene or other UI. You can't layer different blurs together. This is truly just selected in one texture and blurring that particular texture. That's kind of the big caveat, the big con of this particular technique. But you get a lot of cost savings using it, so yeah, give it a try. Let me know what you think. And yeah, maybe if you have ideas of other stuff you want to see, let me know. I'll try to read the comments more often. But other than that, can't wait to see what you folks make, and have a fantastic rest of your day.